Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Marcia Stickford with Livable Raleigh. Welcome to Livable Raleigh's first community conversation of 2023. Livable Raleigh is an all-volunteer nonprofit organization that works to foster transparency and accountability in government by providing accurate information and data, especially related to Raleigh city government. Our community conversations provide an opportunity for Raleigh residents to learn about how government impacts them and provide opportunities for engagement with community leaders and other Raleigh residents on topics of interest. Our program today consists of a presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers and for discussion. Next slide, please. We are fortunate to have Jerry Cohen with us today to answer questions later. Jerry is an adjunct professor at Duke University, a longtime resident of Raleigh, and has served as a legislation drafter in the North Carolina General Assembly and as a member of the Chapel Hill Town Council. Jerry is a well-regarded expert on election law. Next slide, please. You will have several opportunities to participate in the program today. During the presentation, there will be 3 polls that we hope you will participate in. You can also type questions into chat both during and after the presentation. When the presentation is completed, you can also raise your hand and be called on to speak. We've received a number of questions by email, and we'll include those if we've got time. This community conversation is being recorded and will be available on the Livable Raleigh website next week. So let's get started. First of all, could everybody please check to make sure that your microphones are muted? Tim Niles will be our presenter. Tim is a founding member of Livable Raleigh and has lived in Raleigh for over 30 years. He is a Livable Raleigh treasurer, and he maintains our website and social media posts. Next slide. Take it over, Tim.
Good morning, I'm Tim Niles, and I want to thank all of you for coming today. Just a side note, we've got a participant today who has a phobia about dogs, so let's please not anyone have their dog or a picture of dogs on their screens today, and thank you for that. We're here to talk about the state of democracy in Raleigh. Livable Raleigh has identified 3 core issues with our local elections. Next slide, please. The first issue is transparency in government. The way our city council has dealt with changes to our election process in the past has been with a total lack of transparency. The previous city council was elected in October of 2019 for a 2-year term. The next election was scheduled for October of 2021. Next slide, please. 2020 was a census year. Because of the census, Raleigh had to redraw its district lines to balance them by population. But the census data was delayed and didn't arrive in time to redraw the districts for the October 2021 election, so the election had to be moved. Next slide, please. There were 2 opportunities for an election in 2022, either during the state primaries in March or the general election in November. The earliest opportunities for the citizens to choose their representatives for city council was March of 2022. And that is what virtually all other impacted municipalities across the state did. Next slide, please. But the Raleigh City Council asked the state to move the election to November of 22, thereby extending their terms in office by a year and by 8 months more than necessary to deal with the census delay. At the same time, they asked the state to make even more changes that weren't required to deal with the census. They asked to make the move to even years permanent and to change to a plurality election, which eliminates the opportunity for runoffs. This means the winner doesn't have to receive over 50% of the votes and is generally considered to be favorable to the incumbents. Remember, they did this without ever asking you, the people of Raleigh, what you wanted. There was no public input, no public hearing, and no public vote of city council. It was all done behind closed doors. The News and Observer, the entire Wake County delegation to the state Senate, and the governor all agreed that this action should not have taken place in secret. Next slide, please. For more than 50 years, Bob Hall, the co-founder of Democracy NC, has been North Carolina's foremost advocate for the idea that government should be for the people, all the people, and not for the corporations and the wealthy. Bob Hall said this about the actions of Raleigh's city council, quote, "Respect is at the core of democracy. To not respect your citizens enough to bring them in and ask them and talk to them about such a major policy decision is deplorable," end quote. Next slide, please. Changes to our election process should be made in the full light of day with public input and public hearings, not using secret backroom deals with the state legislature to force changes on residents when residents haven't been part of the process. Now let's take our first poll and get your opinion on transparency. Next slide. And the question is, do you think Raleigh City Council should be transparent and include the public in any future decisions made about changes to our election process? Yes or no, or you have no opinion. The poll should be displayed on your screen now. And you can make your choice. We'll give you a minute to answer and then show the results. While we're waiting for everyone to answer the poll, let me take a moment to remind you that we will be answering your questions after the presentation. So if you have a question now, you can type it in chat, or you can use Zoom's raise your hand function during the Q&A session and be called on to ask your question. Do we have the poll results yet? So far, 19 people have taken the poll. We'll wait a bit more and see if more people want to participate.
Tim, will you put the poll back up again? It went off my screen.
Sure. Mike, will you somebody put the poll back up, please?
Thank you.
So everybody who participated in the first round, it knocked you out when we put the poll back up. So can you all answer again, please?
Needs to go up again. Do you need those who answered later to answer again?
Now, you know what? I'm not sure at this point. I'm not sure why the poll is going down. You have control over whether the poll is showing on your own screen. I believe you close it yourself. So I'm not sure what's happening, but let's just assume everybody who has answered both times has said yes. So I think that's good enough for this time around. We've got everybody is answering yes, so that's fine.
So it's 26 out of 26. When I click yes, I guess I'm registered, but it's not showing on my screen.
I believe co-hosts can't vote.
Ah, there you go.
So I think we've proved the point. Everybody says yes, so we're fine. And let's go on with the program.
That was too easy, Tim.
I know these questions are not going to be difficult. So next slide, please. The second issue. Well, now the poll is back. So next slide, please. The second issue is money in politics. Prior to 2019, running for a seat on Raleigh's city council did not require a huge war chest of campaign cash. Next slide. In 2017, the average spend on each of the 5 district council seat races was just over $28,000. But in 2019, that cost exploded to over $106,000, an increase of 376%. That same kind of spending continued in the 2022 election, where Mayor Baldwin increased her spending from $320,000 in 2019 to nearly $800,000 in 2022. So let's try our luck with the polls again. Our second poll now about in politics. Next slide.
Okay, let it cool so we can chop it up.
Let's mute everyone
Okay, just a second then.
and try answering this poll. The question, do you believe there is too much money influencing Raleigh's elections? Yes, no, or no opinion. And just like the last poll, it should be displayed on your screen and you should be able to click on your preferred answer. And again, we'll give it, hey, I'll hum the Jeopardy tune this time while we answer. Do, 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 do. Do 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 do. Have we got the results yet? Because I'm not a good hummer.
We have,
32 say yes, 3 say no.
Okay, so we've got 35 people have answered the question, 32 yes, and 3 say no. Now we'll wait and see if any more want to participate. But it looks like 35 out of 42 participants, so that's probably what we're going to get. So let's move on. And next slide, please. The third issue we want to talk about is that Raleigh City Council election no longer requires a majority of the votes to win. As we noted earlier, with the election being moved to November of even years, Raleigh lost the opportunity to require a majority vote. North Carolina law does not allow for runoffs after a November election. The winner is the candidate with the highest vote total, even if that total is less than 50%. And this is the issue we want to focus on today. Next slide, please. As you can see, 75% of the members of City Council were elected without receiving over 50% of the votes in the last election. And let me clarify, over 50% is a majority for the mayor in the 5 district races. The at-large races are different because of the voting method used. Each voter can vote for 2 candidates in the at-large races for their preference to fill the 2 at-large seats. In those races, 25% is considered the majority, where you could just double the percentage of the vote received to see if the at-large candidates got over 50% of the vote. And that's what you're seeing in our chart here. Next slide, please. It's interesting to note that 5-time Raleigh Mayor Charles Meeker was only elected to his first term as mayor because he had the option to call for a runoff. In that 2001 three-way race, incumbent Mayor Paul Coble received just 587 more votes than Meeker, but still less than 50% of the vote. The runoff election resulted in Meeker being elected as mayor. Next slide. Just last week, the editorial staff of the News and Observer said this about plurality elections, quote, "Changing to elections decided by a plurality raises the possibility that multiple candidates could crowd into races with the winner receiving well under 50% of the vote," end quote. Next slide, please. What can be done about this? Raleigh is governed under what is known as a home rule charter. That charter defines what the city can and cannot do. Raleigh's charter gives the city council the power to implement a nonpartisan primary that would be held at the same time as the state primaries in the spring of 2024. The city does not need any action from the state to do this. Next slide, please. When would primaries be required? A primary is held if 3 or more candidates file for mayor or any of the 5 district seats. A primary is held for the at-large seats if 5 or more candidates file for those. The top 2 finishers in each primary race would proceed to the general election in November, or the top 4 for the at-large seats. For any seats that don't require a primary because only 2 candidates filed to run, those candidates proceed directly to the general election in November. If only 1 candidate files for mayor or a district seat, or only 2 for the at-large seats, those names will appear on the ballot in November as unopposed. But write-in candidates are allowed in the general election. write-in candidates are not allowed in the primary. This is not an unprecedented proposal. Several other cities in North Carolina use primary elections, some partisan, some nonpartisan. Asheville, Durham, Charlotte, and Greensboro, to name a few. In fact, Raleigh held nonpartisan primaries from 1931 until 1978. This process of implementing a primary was most recently used in Asheville for their 2020 elections. In 2018, the legislature moved Asheville's election to November of even years without Asheville asking them to do it. This created the same problem of a plurality election with no possibility of a runoff. Asheville's council immediately recognized this as a problem and started the process to implement a primary. This meant the primary took place in the spring of 2020, followed by the general election in November. So Asheville, by taking quick and decisive action, was able to make sure they never held a plurality election and continued to hold elections requiring a majority to win. Next slide. City Council would need to begin the process by June in order to complete it in time to implement primaries for the 24 election. This timing is affected by two constraints. First, the process has to be completed in time for the Wake County Board of Elections to prepare for candidate filing, which would be held in December of 2023. The second is because City Council takes a summer break from mid-July through mid-August and no action can be taken during that time period. Step by step, this is what has to happen for Council to implement primary elections. First, start to engage and educate the public now. Next, adopt a resolution of intent describing the proposal at a City Council meeting no later than June 6th in order to meet the timeline. This resolution will call for a public hearing to be held no later than June 20th. The public hearing is where the council would formally hear from the public, but they should have been performing outreach and gathering data from the public well before the formal hearing. Once the public hearing is completed, council would enact an ordinance amending the city charter at the next council meeting on July 5th. The council can propose that ordinance become effective with or without a referendum vote. A referendum vote is a vote of the public at the next regularly scheduled primary or general election. Without a referendum, the primary would go into effect March of 2024. The referendum process would delay restoring elections by a vote of the majority by at least 2 years until 2026 at the earliest. As we noted in the earlier segment about transparency, we don't believe the City Council should make any changes to our election process without public input and public hearings. The process we have described here provides for all of that without the need for the referendum. Now let's take our final poll for today because those have been going so well. Next slide. The question, do you believe Raleigh's City Council should implement a primary election in the spring of 2024? Yes, no, or no opinion? And again, we'll give you a minute to answer and then show the results. And I can't see the poll any longer, so somebody else is going to have to tell me when they've answered the question.
So right now, there are 30 votes yes, 4 votes no, 4 votes no opinion.
So that's 38. Is that how many participants do we have?
Now, well, now it's 39, so 31 in favor. I think it just went up to 40. 4 no's and 5 no opinion.
Okay, so what's the percentage of participation that we've got now?
You've got 40 out of 45 who are on who are not co-hosts. I can't vote here, so.
Okay, so that we've got everybody voting. So the results, you read the results again for me, please?
31 say yes, that's 78% of the voters. 4 say no, that's 10% of the voters. 5 have no opinion, that's 13% of the voters.
Great. So let's continue on then. Next slide, please. So we've come to the end of the formal presentation and we're going to open up now for answers to questions from you. And as we said, you can use the raise your hand function of Zoom or type your question into the chat. Either way, please keep yourself muted until you are called on to ask your question. When you are called on, please be mindful of everyone's time and ask your question without getting into a long speech. Our guest today, will remind you again, is Jerry Cohen, and he will take the first shot at answering the questions. But if there's a question that gets into opinion or partisanship, Jerry will pass it back to me. Bob Geary is going to be monitoring the chat and the raised hands for us. He'll read out the questions or call on the next person with a raised hand to ask a question. So let's get started. And I'm going to take the first question as one that we received on email while Bob sorts through the other questions in the raised hands. So the first question was, wouldn't ranked choice voting accomplish the same thing, and why haven't you proposed that? So the answer to that is the General Assembly would be required to enact legislation to allow ranked choice voting. We don't think that's likely to happen under the current leadership, certainly not in time for Raleigh's next election. Instead, we are focusing here on solutions that the City Council can put in place on their own. Okay, Bob, if you've got a question from the
Yeah,
attendant.
we have 4, so I'll take them in the order they came in. Cole McMullen asks, is there an avenue for city council to implement a primary for 2024, but then have a referendum on whether it should be implemented again in 2026 and beyond?
And that's a good question for Jerry's technical expertise. Jerry.
Well, if the city council were to put in effect a primary for 2024 and there was no referendum called either by council or by a 5,000 signature petition, the council, I guess, could then in 2024 propose another charter amendment to repeal that and put it on the ballot in November of 2024 and go back to plurality in 2026. I mean, in theory, that's possible, but I don't know of any situation where that's happened before.
Okay, so now I think that's Yvonne Brannon says, here's a simple question. How do we get council to enact a primary?
I can,
What steps should we take, we, the collective people here, to get the council to act on this?
right. So what I'm going to do is move ahead in my presentation and do what would come later, which is the call to action screen. So here's what you can do to help move the ball forward. Sign up to speak to City Council in person, send emails to the mayor and the councilors, call the mayor and the councilors, write letters to the editor of the News and Observer, Indie Week, the Carolinian, or any other publication you like to read. Talk to everyone you know, your family and your friends, and get them to do the same. So that's how you can get the ball rolling, by letting your councilors and your representatives know what you want them to do.
Okay, so Chantel Miles has a good question, and I'm curious too, why the people who voted no don't think it's a good idea to have a primary. So somebody want to unmute themselves who didn't think this was a good idea and say so, or just say so in the chat. I don't see any hands going up.
Well, if they put an answer to that later, we can certainly read it at that time. So let's move on to the.
All right. Marilee Jacobson says, how many council members would have to vote for the primary process to be considered, but I think really to make it happen? Is it 5 votes? Is it 6?
Yes, I believe it just would be a standard 5 out of 8 majority.
Right, that it would be whatever the normal process is for adopting an ordinance, which I believe is 5 affirmative votes.
Okay. So just so everyone recalls, we have an 8-member council, so 5 is a majority. Barry Erickson wants to know, is the council free to eliminate the 2 at-large seats and add 2 district seats?
Jerry, you want to do that one?
The Home Rule Charter provisions from 1971 do allow council in a similar type proceeding to do that. The only limits are that if there are districts, that a majority of the council must be elected from districts, and the council size could not exceed 12.
Right, so,
All right.
and the other limitation there is if the council does that, they'd have to have time again to redistrict and draw new districts for the next election.
Oh, that would take time. Okay. Cole asks, and I think you already answered this, will the slides from today's presentation, be shared with participants prior to, no, that's prior to the next city council meeting? Here's another question I'd ask. Are we sharing these with city council members?
We will be posting all of the materials from today's event on our website.
Frank Helema asks if any current council members are present for this morning's forum, and I didn't see anybody when I was admitting people, so.
No, I will say that at least two of them told me that they had previous commitments that conflict with this, but that they plan to watch when we post the video.
Okay, Evan Hess wants to know, are there any council members supporting Livable Raleigh? Why, yes. Yes, they're all supporting Livable Raleigh to my, I'm kidding.
I can answer that question. When Livable Raleigh put out their candidate questionnaire last year during the election, one of the questions asked if the candidates would support a primary or moving the election to a place where we could have runoffs. And the 4 new members of council all answered yes to that question. They would support primaries or runoffs. All of the incumbent councilors who remain on council refused to participate in our candidate questionnaire. So we don't know what their position is.
Tim, this is Jerry. I just wanted to add Raleigh has gone through 2 charter amendments previously. In 1972, the 5,000 signatures were collected and the referendum placed on the ballot in November of 72 to go to the current system. Prior to that, there was a 7-member at-large council that elected the mayor from among its membership. And then in 1978, the council proposed a charter amendment by a similar process. The law is still the same, to go from the nonpartisan primary with an October primary and November election to the election and runoff method with an election in October. Council adopted that ordinance, I think unanimously, and there was no petition asking for a referendum on it.
Right. So to add on to what Jerry has just said, if the council chooses not to go forward with creating a primary, the citizens can force a referendum on to the next election cycle. It takes a petition with 5,000 signatures, and the citizens can force a referendum vote on that issue if they want to. That means that if we got the 5,000 signatures, the referendum would appear on the March 2024 ballot. So that would be, and then take effect for the election of 2026. So the only way we're going to get a primary implemented for 2024 is for the city council to implement it and do it without a referendum vote this year. If there are no other questions in the chat right yet, I've got a couple more that we got beforehand. And
Somebody's raising their hand.
oh, perfect.
Phil Poe?
Tim, you had said that there were 4 council members, the older ones, who would not indicate about the primary. Of those 4, is there any particular one that may be more persuadable to support it?
I've not talked to any of them about it. I have no idea.
Okay, thank you.
I think Phil Poe has his hand up.
Yes, I'm just curious, what have been the trends nationally? Have people tried this and continue to do it? Have people tried it and they said this is not working? Are there some statistics about what's been going on?
Well, that sounds like a Jerry Cohen question to me.
Well, I am not sure about trends from plurality to primary or election runoff. In North Carolina, there's 24 of the 500 cities that have either primaries or the election and runoff method. There's about 27 cities that have their elections in the even numbered year, including Asheville, Winston-Salem, Lincolnton, and about 20 small towns. The legislature has been each session moving 3 or 4 from odd to even year. It seems a national trend. A number of states have mandated elections be moved to even years unless a referendum is conducted to void that, California, for example. But I don't know any trends on plurality or election nationwide.
But as we noted, now Jerry will correct me if I get this wrong, most of the major cities in North Carolina do hold primaries.
Right. Asheville, Greensboro, High Point, Durham, among that have the nonpartisan primary, some in odd, some in even years. Winston-Salem has partisan elections in the even year. Charlotte has partisan elections in the odd year. So Wilmington's is the largest municipality, I think, that does not have either a primary or an election and runoff.
Except for Raleigh.
Right, I'm
Which is
sorry,
much
I meant
larger.
other than here.
Yeah. And what we noted in the presentation was when the legislature forced the plurality election onto Asheville, they immediately took action to undo that so that they wouldn't have to have a plurality.
Right, their legislature extended their terms a year and provided for plurality even election, very similar to exactly what happened in Raleigh. In fact, identical, I think.
Phil, is your hand still up? Phil Poe? I'm going to take that as a no. Anybody else want to raise their
Well,
hand?
while we're waiting, I'll get another one of our questions that was sent to us. Here's one. An incumbent who might lose in a spring primary would still be expected to serve through the rest of the year. Do you have concerns about that? And so my answer to that is I'm less concerned about the impact of losing a primary on the incumbent counselor and more concerned about having the best election possible in order to elect officials who have majority support of the people. And do we have any other raised hands yet?
I have a question about that. If an incumbent or if anybody loses in a primary, can they still run as a write-in candidate in the fall?
I don't know the answer to that question. North Carolina has what's called a sore loser statute, but I'm not sure it forbids write-ins.
Okay.
So I can go to
Larry
another.
Miller asks, here you go, here's a good question. For those of you who think too much money is being spent on elections, don't you think adding a primary would increase spending? Also, they would spend a whole year of their 2-year term running for office.
So that was one of the questions actually that was sent into us. So I'm going to take that one and then I'll let Jerry add on to that. So here's what was sent into us as well in email. Wouldn't this place an extra burden, financial or otherwise, on candidates who would essentially be running from the time they file in December through the spring primary and then through the November election? So my answer to that is it may or may not. It's possible that implementing a primary might discourage vanity candidates from filing to run, knowing they will have little chance of advancing to the general election. Financially, you should be aware that the primary and the general elections are considered 2 separate election cycles. So donors who give money to their preferred candidate for the primary can donate again for the general election if their candidate advances. And it also gives us an opportunity here to talk about the possibility of implementing a lower cap on campaign contributions for local city elections. North Carolina's campaign contribution limit is being raised to $6,400 for the next election. And this puts incredible pressure on candidates to bring in huge cash hauls to compete. Lowering the cap does take action from the state, but they have done it recently for both Chapel Hill and Carrboro. Chapel Hills, I think, has a cap of about $378 for the max you can donate to a candidate. And there was an excellent op-ed this week on this very topic from Reeves Peeler, published in the Indie Week. And maybe I can get somebody to put a link to that in the chat. But Jerry, if you want to weigh in on the added cost that might give to candidates.
Well, there's no specific, it's possible that a particular candidate would not have a primary. For instance, in the last cycle, I think there were a couple of races with just 2 candidates. Durham has had situations where there's been a primary for council, but not for mayor, or for one district and not another. So, I mean, there's no way to definitely know until filing closes whether there's a primary or not. But obviously, if you're running twice, it would cost more than running once.
So Helen Tart wants to know, will Raleigh changing its own charter prompt the General Assembly? She asked to make all municipalities plurality, but I'm going to modify her question to say, would the General Assembly be prompted to change it back, to undo what Raleigh had done? They could do that, Jerry, couldn't they? If Raleigh changes its
Yes.
charter, the General Assembly can change it back.
That's certainly possible. I'm not sure. Trying to predict what the General Assembly is or isn't going to do is something anyone is willing to do.
Yeah, I won't make a prediction. All I will do is remind you that earlier in the presentation, we told you that when the legislature did this to Asheville implemented a primary, and the legislature has not changed it back.
All right, good point. So Barry Erickson wants to take us back to the citizens petition process for referendums and for recall elections. And I think we remember what a cluster the process is for that. Anybody want to take on the question of why we're not going to the General Assembly getting that reformed?
I will start and then I'll let Jerry correct me. The petition process for a recall is separate and different than the petition process for a referendum. So the petition process for a referendum takes 5,000 votes. And the petition process that when we were running a recall required 15 to 16,000 votes. It was based on a percentage of the previous voter participation in the previous election. It's 5,000 votes for a referendum. If there's no time limit on that, if the city hasn't taken action there if the city takes action on their own to implement a primary, the citizens have 40 days after that goes into effect to gather the 5,000 signatures and force a referendum. But if the city takes no action at all, either way, then there's no 40-day limit because there's not a 40 days from what? That the residents can gather the signatures they need to force a referendum, either to implement a primary. They can, but now I'll let Jerry correct everything I just said.
No, you're pretty much on point. In 1972, when Raleigh was much smaller, when there was the 5,000 signature requirement, I know from having been around and read a long account for it, and I think it was might have been Smead's York autobiography, which has a whole 10 pages on the 72 referendum. The people in favor of the change stood outside polling places in the May 1972 primary, and at all the polling places, and easily collected their 5,000 signatures. There's no requirement of notaries. Petitions can be printed out and mailed in or whatever, as opposed to the recall and initiative provisions, which has a extremely complicated and arcane procedure. I will tell you, having researched it, that recall local act was copied, if you can believe this, almost verbatim from the 1898 Los Angeles City Charter, and it still includes references to concepts in California election law in the 19th century.
Well, we're right up to date here in Raleigh. Byron Laws has his hand up. Byron? Morning. You're muted, I think?
Was
Yeah.
unmuted? Okay. Good morning. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
So my question is, like, we've seen that, some of this stuff has been in place for a long period of time, and all of a sudden these changes just took place in the past, recent elections, maybe 2 or 3. So my question is, how far are we away from worst case scenario? Like, and I don't know if that makes sense or not, but like, how bad can things get here with the city council elections? And I don't want to say to the point of no return, but it feels like we're getting to like a really dark place where it's kind of, I don't, right now we have options, but how far are we away from not having any options at all, if that makes sense?
I hear you. Tim, you want to field that one?
No, I do not. I'm not quite sure. No, we've always got the options of the citizens being able to force a referendum vote. So the citizens can force a referendum vote to change the number of counselors if they want to. The citizens can force a referendum vote to eliminate the at-large if you'd prefer to have all districts and no at-large. The citizens can force a referendum vote to stop the city council from enacting 4-year terms if they want to. So I'm not sure that I have any further light to shed on that question. I mean,
Go ahead.
what we're talking about today, the situation we had in the last election was that some of the winning candidates got under 40% of the vote and were still declared the winner. So that means over 60% of the people did not want that person on council, but that person is on the council anyway. So that's basically what we're talking about today.
So I have a comment here, and I guess there's a question. Yeah, there is a question in it. Having a primary does not seem as critically needed for the democratic process as the possibility of a runoff to get a majority vote. Would you agree? What would it take to reinstall the runoff election process?
Okay, the only way to have a runoff in North Carolina is to have your election either in off years, in uneven years like we used to in October of 2019, or to actually have the general election in the spring when the other cities are having primary. So but if you have your general election in November in North Carolina, you cannot have a runoff. And neither of those things can happen by city council on their own. Both of those would take action, it would require action of the legislature.
This is Jerry. I would say practically on the runoff issue, it's not possible in the even year to have an October election and November runoff. Absentee voting for the general election starts right before Labor Day. It's not authorized by law, but if there was a runoff after a November election, the election's not canvassed and certified until Thanksgiving. And the process of having a runoff would probably push it to February, and it would be entirely up to the city to pay for the entire cost of a standalone runoff, as opposed under the old system where the costs were shared by 15 municipalities voting in November. It's a long administrative answer, but it would require legislation to have a runoff anyway.
Right. Thanks, Jerry. Eric Braun is asking, and hey, Eric, good morning. Has Livable Raleigh taken a position on changing our elections from 2-year terms to staggered 4-year terms? Is that your question, Eric?
Well, I was just wondering if the organization had, I know what the poll said. I was just curious what the organization, if you all had taken a position or have a position on 2-year versus 4-year terms. They can be staggered or unstaggered.
Yeah, well, we haven't taken a formal position yet on that, but we note that the poll, the citywide poll that was taken just a year ago with over 1,260 respondents, 73% of them were opposed to four-year terms. And our position certainly would be, if the city council decides they want to go to four-year terms, that should be done only with a referendum vote. And it should be done without asking the legislature to give any of the current councilors an additional part to start the stagger. So at the earliest, we would suggest that in 2024's primaries, they should ask the voters to say if they want the city council to go to four-year terms or not. And if they vote for that, then fine, implement it. And they should ask them if they want staggered terms or not. And if they do, then go ahead and implement it. But the city council should never implement something like four-year terms without getting a referendum vote of the public.
They shouldn't sneak off to the General Assembly to get it done. Is that your point?
That's my point. The General Assembly could do that on their own and force it on the city without the city doing it on their part to give the city cover. Just like they did just like they did to Asheville by moving them to even years when Asheville didn't ask for it. Just like the city went behind closed doors last time around and asked the council to move their election to November. So it looks like, hey, we didn't do it. The legislature did it to us. So that we would be against that.
Helen Tart has her hand up. So Helen? Are you muted?
Sorry. I was sort of going back to Byron's law's question as far as what can the city council do to get back at the voters if we, forced to vote. And I think this is for Jerry. And as far as what kind of powers does the council have as far as changes and things that might make it harder to vote or harder for certain people to vote, if you understand what I mean?
This is Jerry. The city has no control over the election process. That's run under state laws and administered by the county.
Okay. So there's not much
other than
do.
Other than a form of government, which we've discussed previously with charter amendments, but the policies on how the election is run itself are not in any way in the control of the city.
Yeah, I've not seen the city try to stop people from voting. In fact, going to even year elections, we about tripled the turnout in city elections. So that seemed to be a good thing.
Yeah, that was the reason the city wanted to move to even year elections, was to get more turnout than the pitiful 15 or 16% we used to get when we had off-year elections. But if I understood what Helen was asking, I think she also wanted to ask, what could the city do in retribution if the citizens get together and get 5,000 signatures to force a referendum vote for a primary or any other thing? And I don't think that the city council can do anything for retribution other than what their charter currently allows them to do, which is to set up the number of council districts they have and the length of terms, those specific things that they can do without legislative action.
Tim, let me ask a question. I don't think we've answered this, and our Livable Raleigh group has thought this through. But can you reconstruct the process that caused us to want a nonpartisan primary as opposed to a partisan primary?
Okay, a nonpartisan primary means there's not individual primaries for each party or for for like the Democrats or Republicans, the Green Party, the Socialist Party, that type of thing. A partisan primary means each party has their own primary. And if you do a partisan primary, you will end up with the same non-runoff possibilities in the general election because you will have more than 2 participants in each of the races. So you will have running for mayor, a Democrat, a Republican, a Green Party, a Socialist Party, an independent. So you will end up with more than 2 participants getting less than 50% of the vote and no possibility for a runoff. So the only way for a primary to fix the lack of a runoff is to have a nonpartisan primary.
Okay, great.
Oh, this is Jerry. I want to add one thing is that I don't have any personal position on whether there should or shouldn't be a primary or a change in the charter. Just wanted to make that clear.
Okay.
Jerry,
Anybody else want to raise their hand and ask a question? I think we've hit everything that was raised in the chat.
I think there's one more question in the chat.
And
Barry
Phil's
Erickson,
hand is
Barry Erickson asks, would informal online citizen petitions be effective to pressure the council to move forward on any particular topic we've discussed? And
Yeah,
that's not a Jerry question.
couldn't hurt.
couldn't hurt, but we had been told in the past by the previous council, not this one, that if they got lots of form letters, emails, or whatever, that they were discounting them. So I don't know how they would feel about online petitions, but might be worth going to council and asking. And Phil Poe's hand is up again.
Yes, this is a campaign financing question. You know, we talked about the hypothetical of maybe lowering the maximum contribution. However, I believe a candidate can actually put as much money into a campaign as they want. And of course, we at the national level right now, we have an interesting situation as to where money actually came from for a specific candidate. So you talk about maybe trying to do the right thing. I guess people are always trying to sort of work around systems. So I guess when you talk about campaign financing in general, I guess the first question would be, is there any maximum limit for a candidate at the local level, or I guess at the state level in North Carolina? And if in fact people start maybe bringing money in the back door, is there any way to audit a candidate to make sure there isn't any funny business going on?
That sounds like a Jerry Cohen question to me.
Well, if a candidate is spending their own money, which is unlimited, I guess, under the First Amendment, then they still must file campaign finance reports, as must independent political action committees. For instance, in Chapel Hill, while donations to individual candidates are limited, there are political action committees, several of them, that you can make contributions up to several $1,000s to, who can then make independent expenditures on behalf of candidates. So the landscape has changed since 2006 or 7, when that limit was enacted in Chapel Hill, pre-Citizens United.
Right. So yes, it wouldn't eliminate a candidate from spending their own money. And it wouldn't eliminate outside groups from spending money on their behalf. But when an outside group spends money on the candidate's behalf, it has to be clearly labeled as being spent by that group, not being spent by the candidate. So it can't come into your mailbox and appear like the candidate sent it to you. But the one thing that I will note as a personal opinion is in the last primary election, the candidates who flooded people's mailboxes or got people's mailboxes flooded with excess materials from outside groups didn't fare as well as candidates who sent 2 or 3 things and then left people alone. Because as I recall, Patrick Buffkin had like 15, 16 mailers that went out in his primary. Not all of them came from him. It came from outside sources supporting him, But all I heard from people was, if I get one more piece of mail from Patrick Buffkin, I will never vote for him again.
Okay,
That was Tim Niles editorializing as Tim.
yes. Wanda Hunter wants to know, with the advance of technology, and this is a good question, can't we do something to get online petitions made possible? Why do we have to go out on a street corner with our pen and pencil and a clipboard and get people to actually sign their name? And having asked that question, anybody want to answer it? Jerry, you
That's
want to
gotta
answer
be a
that?
Jerry question. I have no idea what has to happen to make that happen.
Harry,
And
you're
Joe-
on mute.
And Joe Trossel asked the same question. Good question from Wanda Hunter. If a petition was pursued to require a referendum, can any or all of that be done online and be legal?
This is Jerry. Unlike our initiative and referendum and recall provisions in the city charter that date back to 1898, which have been only successfully used once in the 80s, you could, if there was a petition for a charter change, it could be on a website. The voter could print it out, sign it, and mail it back to the organizer. I don't think you can have images or whatever and emailed, but it can be decentralized. It could be left out on at store counters. I mean, I've seen that in the past in prior campaigns.
Okay, so
Raleigh's,
that sounds like it's because there's no requirement to notarize things so that no one has to physically witness the signature taking place.
that is correct. And that was certainly true in the 72 city charter referendum.
Great. So it sounds like we could do it online as long as the signer printed it out, physically signed it, and mailed it back to us, or brought it back to us in some way.
So Carolyn Guckert says, I think on the street canvassing is more effective as it's an educational tool to make people aware of the issue. So maybe that applies to what we're trying to get done with the nonpartisan primary. Should we be collecting signatures on that?
You can, but what I will warn against again is the only way to get a nonpartisan primary implemented for the next election cycle, which is 2024, is for the city council to do it without a referendum. If the citizens go out and gather signatures to force a referendum, the referendum vote would happen in March of 2024, and a primary couldn't happen until the 2026 cycle at the earliest. So the efforts to get this done would be better spent pressuring the city council members to do this. And then if they don't do it, then if they don't start the process in time to get it done, then yes, go ahead with the petition process to force a referendum in March of 2024.
Wanda Hunter, good morning. Your
Good
hand is
morning.
up.
I just wanted to go back to about the technology and the online petitions. I think that it's a huge loss with the advancement of technology to even want to require people to print out something. And also, if these petitions have to be then approved by the clerk, the county clerk, or whoever the state board of elections, why does it have to be notarized and all of these other things? These are just things that hinder what will make democracy actually a good democracy for people to be inclusive in participation. And with what Carolyn was saying about canvassing is more effective, when you think about the onset of COVID and you think about who are the most prevalent voters, you're talking about the population who has been more scared of coming out of their homes or interacting with too many people, which are older population, because those are the people who turn out to vote. So street canvassing, yeah, it could work, but are those going to be the people that are going to be at the polls casting the ballots is the question that you need to ask.
I would say, this is Jerry, as I said previously, the 1972 citizen-initiated referendum was done consciously by the organizers by having people outside all then, I think, 40 Raleigh city precincts on the primary in May of 1972 collecting signatures where everyone that went by was eligible. And they then turned those into the county or city. I can't remember what the law was exactly and where you turned them in. I mean, most successful referendum campaigns involve collecting signatures at polling places. Raleigh's last referendum was on the Western Boulevard extension, which was a citizen-initiated referendum in 1986, 88. I don't know. I remember being solicited. Somebody was outside a polling place on Creedmoor Road in, I don't know, 86 or 88 collecting signatures, and they got enough to put it on the ballot. They didn't succeed, but the referendum was defeated. But
And just to clarify one more time, these signatures, for a petition for these referendums do not require notarization.
not for charter amendment
Right.
petitions. That's correct.
Right.
So this
Bob Mulder has his hand up, and then we have a question from, well, Bob Mulder's got his hand up.
Yes, I just, one question. I worry a little bit about making things too easy by doing stuff online and not requiring a little more effort. And the reason I say that is because I've always been totally against the voting machines that are just on screen. You know, you have a computer and those kind of things are much too easily manipulated. And I like what we have in Wake County, which is you have to fill out a paper ballot. It gets scanned by a machine, but you've got that paper ballot to go back and do a count. So I think the easier you make things to do online, the greater the possibility of fraud. And that cuts in both directions, not just Democrats and not just Republicans, but both Democrats and Republicans. And I think we need to have some safeguards in place. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Carolyn is asking, is there an election this year to stand outside the polls of, oh, Jerry, are there any elections this year?
Not in the city of Raleigh, the other 15 municipalities. Yes, the next time a referendum could be held under state law is on the date of the 2024 primary. Next one after that is the 2024 general election in November.
Okay.
Jerry, I need you to clarify this for me to answer that same question then. If we wanted, if citizens wanted to stand outside the polls to gather signatures for a referendum on plurality or any other referendum on a charter change, they could do it at the primary in 2024. And then that, if they're successful in gathering the signatures, it would appear on the 2024 general election. And if it passed, it would go into effect for the 2026 cycle.
That would be correct. That's what was exactly what was done in 1972.
So doing it at the 2024 spring primary is just as, would accomplish it for the 2026 cycle just as fast as doing it by referendum now. Because first, the earliest referendum, if you do this by referendum vote, the earliest it's going to be able to take effect is the 2026 cycle.
I see Helen with her actual hand raised, and Yvonne, although she has not used the raised hand symbol, actually has her hand up.
Sorry. My question about approaching people at the polls as a poll official, you can't campaign at people standing in closer than 25 or 50 feet, depending on which polling place it is. Can you approach people standing in line, you know, get them as right as they're going in for a referendum?
No.
Yeah. Wouldn't you have to do the referendum gathering the same way people do poll greeting and handing out party slate cards and that type of thing? So you have to be outside the distance, and then you could do your gathering outside the 25 or 50-yard distance or whatever the distance is for that particular polling place. Once you're outside that distance, you can gather your signatures just like people hand out materials.
Yeah, well, and I've done my share of handing out too, and people really avoid that. You know, a lot of them do, but I guess if you had a sign saying referendum or something, maybe they would come to you. But I was just wanted to make sure that the rules were the same.
Yes. We did have in 2022 a unaffiliated candidate petition at the primary that a candidate for judge was circulating. I saw that candidates petition tables at several places to be on the ballot as an unaffiliated candidate for judge, district court judge, for what that's worth.
Yvonne, I'm going to call on you. Unmute yourself.
Done. First of all, I don't know where the hand thing is. That's why this goes up. But my question goes back to campaign financing. So I'm willing to wait until all the questions come up on the petition.
Okay.
Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. The main problem I see with campaign financing is the special interest groups and the large amounts of money they put in, canceling out the smaller amounts that individual citizens are able to contribute. How can we legally limit the amount of special interest contribution?
No, you have to get your federal government to undo Citizens United.
Okay. All right. So how do we counter what these special interest groups are doing? That's been our main problem in Raleigh.
You have to create your own special interest group.
Oh.
Livable Raleigh has been accused of being a special interest big dollar PAC. We aren't, but we spent, maybe $15,000 on an election cycle. So we are certainly not a dark money PAC, although people accused us of it all the time.
We didn't spend any money supporting individual candidates, to my knowledge.
Well, we aren't allowed to donate money to individual campaigns. We
did endorse
individual candidates.
Yeah. Eric Braun has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Just to clarify and make sure I'm not understanding, the 5,000 vote requirement just forces, or I wouldn't say force, puts the issue, one, it can force the council to vote on it, but it also just puts it on to the referendum. It doesn't actually change the charter itself. And I just want to make sure I'm understanding that correctly.
In fact, I think it does just put it on the ballot. It doesn't even force the council to vote on it. The council doesn't, the 5,000 signature petition takes the council out of the process, puts it on the next election ballot for the voters to decide.
That's correct, Tim. The council would have to vote on what the election date would be, but that's been taken out of the hands of the city by a 2013 law. There can't be special elections on it. So the city's choice has to be basically the next election. I think the city clerk and board of elections has to verify the petitions to make sure there are 5,000. It goes to the council, which then simply passes a resolution setting the date of the election. It's not a substantive vote.
Okay, Eric, you good with that? Your hand's
Yes,
still up.
thank you.
Okay. All right, I'm not seeing any new questions or comments in the chat. I will say that some places have matching funds for candidates as a way to offset the financial effect of special interest groups, but I think we're a long way from being able to do that in Raleigh. So there are many things we could try to do in theory, but the one thing we actually can do, in fact, with a simple process, is get this primary instituted for our next election.
Right. And if there aren't any other questions, I've got one more question that was mailed to us ahead of time. And I'm going to let Jerry handle this after I take a quick shot at it. And the question was, wouldn't adding a primary increase the cost by adding, in effect, another election? And Jerry and I spoke about this the other day. And when Raleigh had its own election in October of off years, it used to cost Raleigh, because they weren't sharing it with a bunch of other cities and counties. And so it cost Raleigh about $1.1 million to have those elections. Raleigh's participation in the last election last November was about $500,000. And adding a primary, depending on how many primaries actually had to happen based on how many people filed to run, might cost somewhere around $400,000 or $500,000 more. So we'd still be spending less in total with a primary and a general than we used to spend with off-year general elections. And Jerry will correct me if I got any of that wrong from our previous discussion.
No, that's all correct on the costs. And under the old system, it would have been about $1.1 million in October. And then the runoff would probably be about $900,000, the November runoff, if that had happened under the old system.
So it would have been about 2 million in under the current. And if we add a primary and a general here, we're talking back to about $1 million total for both of them.
Right. And there's so much variables based on what are the things on the ballot. Kerry's talking about having a bond issue on the 2024 primary ballot, which means they'd be part of the cost sharing. So it's election budgeting is all pretty complicated series of contracts.
Diane Silver in chat suggests that activists could go to council to get them to initiate the referendum. I guess that's true, but if we want this primary for 2024, the way to get that done is to get council to do it starting in June.
Right. If we want this to happen as soon as possible, we want council to use the power they have to do it without a referendum, as long as they are educating and getting the citizens involved in the process and getting the citizens to say, yes, this is what we want without a referendum. They can do that with gathering data, engaging the public, holding a public hearing, and getting this public on board, and then doing it without requiring a referendum, which would put it off until 2026.
So Cole McMullen asks, what are some possibilities for asking the General Assembly to allow ranked choice voting? And that's a good question.
Good question for Jerry. I don't know how to deal with the General Assembly.
I don't have any position nor suggestions on that issue.
It sounds to me like if you want to do that, the best way to do that is contact your local state senator or state representative and have that discussion with them.
I think an indirect way to do it would be to get the council to ask its lobbyist, who is Philip Isley, put it on their legislative agenda to recommend to the General Assembly that they consider ranked choice voting. I don't see any evidence that they are considering it, and I don't see any evidence that they're gonna consider it in this session. But I don't think it's even on their radar screen. So it took them 10 years to approve medical marijuana. I think ranked choice voting might move faster than that, but I don't think it's going to move this year. Steve Breckbiel, how do you say that name, Steve?
That's Breckbiel.
Breckbiel, you want to ask the question that you put in chat?
Sure. One of the benefits to the even year elections is the higher voter turnout. I mean, we saw it was significantly more people voting in these elections. So I guess the question is primary turnout is usually significantly lower, right? Because NC in 2022, it was 20% for the primary, 51% for the general election. So you have a smaller number of voters deciding the top candidates, and then a larger, versus a larger number of voters picking the candidate of their choice. And I understand majority versus polarity, but does, mathematically, I guess it's almost a statistical question, with a larger number of voters selecting from 3, does the winning candidate actually end up with more votes than they did coming in through a primary?
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, I will say in 2024, we're going to have primaries for governor in both parties, and I presume the Libertarians are also going to have a primary for governor. So primary turnout in 2024 should be pretty good, but it probably won't be anything like the general election.
I actually
turnout.
have some numbers on that. The municipal elections in the odd year turnout has varied anywhere from 13 to 16%. Partisan primaries, even year primaries tend to be in the midterm, maybe 22%. For a presidential primary, it's on the high side of 30% turnout. That's probably to be expected next year. The general election and the midterm in Wake County is usually about 62%, and the presidential, it's been 79 or 80% turnout.
And again, so this would be a nonpartisan primary, so it would be there would be a higher participation percentage-wise in a nonpartisan primary than a partisan one, I would think. And certainly the primaries do get a better turnout than the old off-year elections that we had in October.
Well, Steve's making a point. I'm not sure it's a decisive one, but it's something to consider.
Can I just comment on that point?
Sure.
It is true, obviously, that the turnout is higher, but I think there's 2 other things that sort of mitigate against the benefit of that just a little bit. And one is that a lot of voters who turn out in because it's a general primary or general election are really not following the down ballot races that much, and they're not that well educated often about that. So more voters is good, more well-informed voters would be better, and that's something that I think is difficult, especially because, again, when the down ballot candidates like for city council, school board, county commissioner are running, they all have to spend a lot more money and work a lot harder to get their position known, their name known, that sort of thing, because people are paying, again, more attention to who's running for the General Assembly, who's running for Congress, that sort of thing. So there's always trade-offs, and I don't think there's any one thing that is just out. It's clear that this is the right thing to do.
This is Jerry. I can stay for one more question. And I did put in the chat what the actual ballot looked like in 2022. You'll see 3 different ballots way up in the chat: the Democratic primary, Republican primary, and unaffiliated, on what their city council ballot looked like. So you can see that what the nonpartisan primary ballot looked like.
So Phil Poe, do you have your hand up again?
Yes, I do. As far as ranked choice, I know my wife and I have had this conversation about complexity in the elections, and I'm wondering if there have been any studies done about ranked choice. Do people say, damn, this is too confusing, I'm just not going to vote? I always get concerned where we try to overkill some of these situations because it's the old KISS approach. I think if you do keep it simple, I think this is my assumption, that more people will participate. Does anybody have any opinion, or has anybody seen any studies that would sort of validate that assumption?
I don't know. Diane Silver says tons of studies about ranked choice are available at fairvote.org. Data shows voters understand it and like it. I would just add that if you're not familiar with other candidates than your first choice, you're not required to rank 2, 3, 4, 5 on the ballot. You just vote for the candidate you like, I believe.
The only other piece of data I've heard about ranked choice as it would apply to us here in Wake County is Wake County's ballots are so long already and that you don't get to city council until the end of the second page, if you then add ranked choice to that, then that makes it even longer. So I don't know whether participation falls off if it gets even longer or not. And I don't know if Jerry has any more information on that or not.
Well, Wake County currently in the presidential election uses both sides of a 16-inch ballot. Part of it's limited by how many constitutional amendments the legislature puts on the ballot, bond issues. We're a long ballot state. There's 40-some races. If every race on the ballot was ranked choice voting in North Carolina, then the paper ballot counties would probably have, each voter would have 3 pieces of paper instead of 1 to vote. If it was just city council, that might be different, but there's obviously I'm not arguing against ranked choice voting, but that there are some administrative issues in a long ballot state like North Carolina. I grew up in Connecticut where the general election ballot had 5 offices. I came here and there's 40.
They do have ranked choice in Maine, and they like it up there, but smaller state. Not physically, actually, but in terms of population. So I think we're coming to the end of an hour and a half. Anybody want to take over?
I can, well, yes, so I can get back to our program if we're done with questions. And I will say, if there are questions that you have that we didn't get to today, or if you think of questions about this topic, you can email them to us at livableraleigh@gmail.com. And we will add those to the website once we post all the information from today's event. If you go to our website under the resources tab, you will find a page called Community Conversations, and that's where we will be publishing today's information, and that's where we've published the information from all the events we've held over the last 3 years. And can I go to the next slide, please? So this is our call to action again of what you can do, and I'm going to tell you the same things. If you want to move this forward, sign up to speak to the city council, send emails to the city council, write letters to the editors of the News and Observer, Indie Week, Carolinian, or anyone else. Talk to everybody you know. Next slide, please. Again, I want to thank all of you for being here today. As Marcia told you at the start of the program, we're an all-volunteer nonprofit organization. If you feel you've benefited from today's program, you can help us continue to advocate for the local issues that matter with a donation. You'll find a donate page with instructions on our website. And just to note, donations are not tax deductible. Now I'm going to hand the program back to Marcia to close us out. Marcia?
Everybody, thanks for taking part in this community conversation. We appreciate that so many of you hung in there and showed up on a Saturday. And part of what Livable Raleigh works to do is to make elections more accurately reflect the will of Raleigh voters. That's one of our primary focuses. We will use the insights that we gained today to explore topics for additional events. So please check out the Livable Raleigh website for more information on how to support these efforts and how to be involved. And again, we really appreciate your participation.